Welcome to Adaptive Music Adventures. In this episode, we are going back to the opera and we are having a look at my hybrid experiment. Is this a completely new technique? Probably not. I'm pretty sure someone else out there must have tried something like this, but I've never seen it. I'll be using Wwise to implement this experiment because it's the only middleware that I'm aware of that's capable of doing this. The way I'm implementing this may not even be the best approach. Always welcome to add your ideas and suggestions to the discussion. Now I have seen some other approaches. For this example from Dota 2, Chance Thomas wrote 3 pieces of music that follow the same chord progression. One for exploring, one for questing, and one for combat. He would then use a vertical submixing technique where he only allowed to quickly crossfade between these tracks on the next beat or bar. Unfortunately, I don't have an example for this, but you can watch him explain this in detail in this video. In the game Remember Me, the composer Olivier Hofer used a horizontal technique with segments to underscore how well you're doing in a fight. However, if you are doing exceptionally well, stringing together a bunch of combos, he will fade in a vertical layer to add intensity.
So now let's see the combo system and how you go from the combo to the God mode. So this is where this extra layer comes in. There is what we call an RTPC right here that will ramp up. The more combo you do, the more you get this. And this is just a layer that does that. So you don't hear it if you're not good, but the better you are, the more you're going to do it. Hear it. But then, why is this? It's because it's also a great way to do a transition from the combo to the God mode. Let's listen to the result.
The game Infamous 2 also uses segments to move between exploration and combat, but they fade in an extra layer when you're badly hurt. So, what am I after? First of all, no crossfading. That means I'll have to be using segments somehow. I want to have every instrument start and finish every phrase musically. I also want to have one continuing piece of music, where instruments or vocalists can join and drop out. That means that for this technique, I don't want to jump to another piece of music. I want to be able to continue a melodic idea regardless of the intensity required by the game state. I want to continue developing a melody instead of having it interrupted in the middle of a phrase. That means I do somehow want to have vertical layers within my segments. If we were to slice a score sheet, we would not only slice it in layers, but we'd also slice it in segments. Obviously, as we did before with our segments, we don't want to cut them straight. We want to cut every instrument in such a way so that we never cut in the middle of a phrase. That means that some instruments will have their tail overlap with the next segment. And that means that some instruments will have no content in some segments, but that's okay. As I said, this is one continuing piece of music, so as with a vertical technique, the playhead just continues forward, and it loops back right at the end. Horizontal movement is constant, and changes in intensity happen vertically. Although the cool thing about this method is that you could just as well move to a new piece of music, just as you could with regular segments. Could you achieve this result with a horizontal approach by just using regular segments? Sure, you could. You would have a regular playlist for exploration and a regular playlist for suspense. Both playlists and the segments inside them would simply follow the same musical structure, just using different instruments and maybe a little bit more notes. All you'd have to do then is define a transition rule. If this segment is playing, and the game state changes to suspense, cue this segment next and then continue with the suspense playlist from there. Or when this segment is playing and the game state changes, jump to this segment next and continue from there. And then you'd have to define a transition rule for every single segment, in both directions. You can quickly see that by simply adding segments, and certainly when adding more game states or intensity variations, the amount of required transition rules would grow exponentially. There would be a lot of them. A lot of them. Using the hybrid technique, even though it's using segments, we will not have to create any transition rules. But make no mistake, it is going to take some work to record all these segments separately. One of the things I want to do in the opera is when Lara gets on the stage, I want the voice of an opera singer joining the orchestra. Using good old vertical layering, that would sound something like this. Fading. See, that's not how a singer would join the orchestra. Something else that I want to do is to have the orchestra continue performing the same piece of music, but increase the intensity in that performance when Lara is attacked by bad guys. And dogs. Fades all over the place. So this is how we're gonna do it. I'm gonna record 2 submixes of the orchestra, and I'm gonna record them in segments. I'm going to record Aaron in segments. Let's listen to 2 segments of the orchestra submix for exploration. And this is Aaron in isolation. Now, let's imagine that we're in the middle of the first segment and Laura enters the stage. What I want is Aaron to wait for the next phrase before she starts singing. Like I said, for the orchestra, I've recorded 2 submixes, also in segments. Here are 2 segments of the orchestra performing the combat intensity. And here's the exploration version of the same measures. Now imagine we're in a combat game state and we shoot the last guy. If we apply these 2 examples to the entire piece in Cubase, this is what that looks like. Isn't that pretty? But how are we going to implement this in our middleware? Got a whole lot of segments. Put them all in a sequential playlist. And inside each segment I have 2 tracks, 1 track for the orchestra and 1 track for Aaron. The orchestra track contains 2 sub-tracks. I'll get back to these in a minute. I also defined 2 game states. I have a group called Opera Intensity, which can be set to Combat or Explore. I also have an Opera Voice group, which has only 1 state that I can turn on or off. So I can tell the middleware, now I want to hear the Opera Voice sing, now I don't want to hear the voice. Let's listen to the first segment. We are exploring and we are not on the stage. Let's say that next time we play this segment, we're still exploring, but Laura is on the stage. We need a way of switching on or off the Opera Voice track. We can do that by turning the opera track into a switch track. I need to specify that the switch is controlled by the Opera Voice game state group. Now right-click on the track itself and associate this particular track with the active state from that group. So next time we start playing this segment, before it starts playing the opera track will be switched on if the Opera Voice state is active, or switched off if the state is inactive. So, once more, with the Opera Voice inactive, and with the Opera Voice game state set to active. So here's the cool thing about switch tracks. The switch can only be set before a segment starts playing. It cannot be changed while it's playing. So if the game state happens to change while it's playing, the switch will only be changed after the segment has finished playing. I set up the orchestra track in a similar way. First I turned this track into a switch track and linked it to the Opera Intensity state group. Inside the orchestra track, I've created 2 sub-tracks. 1 sub-track contains the submix for the combat version, and I've associated the sub-track with the combat game state. The other sub-track contains the Explore submix, and I associated this one with the Explore game state. The state group can be set to only one of these states at any given time, so only one of these 2 sub-tracks will be played at any given time. So, let's say, as before, Laura is exploring and she's not on the stage. And the same segment now if Laura were in combat. So here's the second segment. Let's play the first and second segment now and imagine the game state changes from combat to explore during the first segment. And of course, every segment in the playlist is set up in exactly the same way. Basically, that's the whole thing, so let's listen to the final result. There's one little issue that I ran into with switch tracks. Let me show you what that's about. Here's a simple example. As before, I have a subtrack for Explorer, and a subtrack for Combat. Now listen what happens when I switch game states. It sounds like it's just instantly cutting to a different segment and there's no smooth transition. That's because that's exactly what's happening. This red marker shows the last beat of the segment. It's called the exit cue, and it's used to sync the first beat of the next segment marked with the green marker. I said before that the switch of these segments can only be changed before the segment starts playing. As soon as the segment has started playing, the switch will not be changed, even if the game state is changed while the segment is playing. It will wait and only change the switch after the segment has finished playing. Unfortunately, instead of waiting until the entire segment has played, Wwise will only wait until it has reached the exit cue. That means that if you have a tail in your segment, the switch will be turned off at the exit cue and any audio after the exit cue will be cut off. Or if the switch was already off and the game state was activated while the segment was playing, the switch will be turned on at the exit cue, and while the track or subtrack was silent, any audio after the exit cue will now suddenly be audible. I don't know why it works this way. Is it a bug? Is it a feature? But there's a workaround. Look at the entry and exit cue markers in this version. This is the original version, and this is the version with the workaround. All I did was shift the exit cue all the way to the right so that any audio from the tail is now present before the exit cue. By doing that, I've created an offset that I also have to apply to the entry cue of the next segment so that the exit and entry cues are still aligned to be in sync. So once more, this is what the original version sounded like. And this is the result when we shift the entry and exit markers. Anyway, let's go back to the Opera and look at the final result inside the game. We'll look at a couple more hybrid examples with a few twists next time in the final episode. See you then. Bye.
$100,000 to come to Santa Poco, put on show stop. The infamous El Guapo.
What does that mean? Infamous.
Oh, Dusty. Infamous is when you're more than famous. This man, El Guapo, is not just famous, he's infamous.
$100,000 to do a personal appearance with this guy El Guapo, who is probably the biggest actor to ever come out of Mexico.
Wow, the infamous? Infamous?